Two of our readings this weekend deal with miraculous feedings. We begin with Elisha, who has 100 people to feed and only has 12 barley loaves. And they wonder how he's going to do that. But the power of God is at work, and it's plenty for those who are there. And there's a reminder of that as we go to our gospel, where the abundance that Jesus provides is much greater. It's John's version of the feeding of the 5,000. And here is this crowd who've come to listen to Jesus, and now they're hungry. They need to be fed. What are they going to do? All they have are the 5 loaves and 2 fish that a little boy in the crowd has brought with him. And Jesus tells the disciples to feed them themselves. How are they going to do this? As I say, they discover the little boy, but what use is that? So Jesus tells them to get the people to sit down, and he takes that little amount, those 5 loaves and those 2 fish, and he divides them, and there's plenty. The disciples spend the time clearing up baskets full of the scraps left over. 2 things perhaps to notice. One is that line of Jesus, feed them yourselves. We can hear that addressed to us. How can we possibly do the things that God expects of us? How can we proclaim the gospel? How can we live out a Christian life? How can we be signs of God's love for our world? It is because that power of God is at work with us. But we are asked to be God's instruments. Not to rely on ourselves, no, but to be the instruments through which that abundant love and power of God can operate. And the second thing about this particular version of the feeding of the 5,000 is that it leads on to something yet more wonderful, because it's the beginning of what's called the Eucharistic discourse in John. He's going to be talking to those crowds about giving himself as bread, giving himself for the life of the world. And we recognize in that the Eucharist. Recognize what comes as we celebrate Mass together. Recognize the way in which Jesus gives himself to us in a way that's so much more wonderful than even the feeding of the 5,000. And maybe that leads us on to St. Paul, writing from prison to say that the community he's writing to should live out the gospel, should be signs of unity, signs of love. And that's what we are called to do as God's instruments, relying on that power of God that we see in the feeding of the 5,000 and what above all we experience in the Eucharist.